more money.
I now have the honor of introducing to you Elizabeth Allison, who is a political ecologist, an environmental ethicist, and social entrepreneur. Who is also an associate professor in the philosophy and religion department at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and she's the founding director of the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program. She holds graduate degrees from Yale and UC Berkeley, and she's had articles published in Mountain Research and Development, the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature and Culture, among others. Some of her current projects, a forthcoming essay titled The Spiritual Significance of Glaciers in an Age of Climate Change that I believe is about to come out, and a book that she's working on titled The Political Ecology of Happiness, Religion, Environment, and Development in Modernizing Bhutan. Please help me welcome Elizabeth Allison.
Thank you, Becca, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Matt, virtually, for organizing this panel and inviting me to be part of it. What may be some obstacles. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what are the modernist paradigm, and I feel like we're all pretty solid on some of those problems given the last day and a half. And we've also talked about hope for the future and visions of the future and what we would like to see and what would be a more inclusive, holistic paradigm or cosmology or worldview. And then one always asks, well, how do we get from here to there, right? And there are lots of answers to that question, and there are lots of obstacles. So I want to just take one pretty small obstacle and think through it, because in my studies, environmental policy management, I see lots of ways that we try to get to where we're going, and then lots of ways that we get stymied on that pathway. So the question that animates this talk, as far as reimagining late modernity, is are there ways that our knowledge practices actually get in the way of ecological justice or ecological sustainability or ecological flourishing? And I'm going to suggest one way in which they may get in the way, and then at the end suggest some ways to ameliorate that. This title is perhaps rather obscure, and intentionally so. The idea of learning from mountain elders is that maybe we can learn, as Josefina and Sherry have suggested, not only from those humans who have come before us, but also from the other beings around us, including the ones that we might seem to be inanimate. But I think that idea is actually fairly submerged in this talk, so that's why I mentioned it from the outset. So can I have the next slide? So this is where we're going to go in the next 45 minutes or 40 minutes. Considering modern reductionism as a form of epistemic and ecological injustice. This term, epistemic injustice, comes from the feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker, and I'm going to talk about what it means. And she identifies two types of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. And just bracket those, I'll come back and define them. And then I want to look at some examples of epistemic injustice as related to environmental injustice in environmental history. So I'm going to take one example from the past, the case of Love Canal, which is widely credited with initiating the environmental injustice movement, and I'll explain that case study. And then two examples from the present, climate change and the Anthropocene, and suggest ways in which epistemic injustice is limiting our ability to address these with as much efficacy as we might hope. And then I'm going to suggest some ways to move towards greater justice in ecological living. Next slide. So what is epistemic injustice? Miranda Fricker, in her 2007 book called Epistemic Injustice, says epistemic injustice is the injustice that is done or inflicted upon someone in their reality as a knower. So as you are a person who knows things, something that gets in the way of your sharing that knowledge is an epistemic injustice. And so epistemic injustice then limits our collective ability to have as much knowledge as we could have. So she identifies two forms of epistemic injustice. Testimonial injustice, which is when the speaker is ignored or disbelieved because of their social location. And generally this arises out of various forms of social prejudice. So if we discount someone's speech because they're female, because they're young, because they're old, because they're of a certain ethnicity, because they're of lower income or higher income, because of their sexual orientation, or even because of anthropocentrism, even because if we discount knowing because it's a non-human knower. I went to a fantastic talk on primates, other than human primates yesterday, and where the speaker showed so many ways in which chimpanzees and bonobos share their knowledge with human beings. And I don't think we're really considering that kind of knowledge in our efforts towards greater ecological justice whatsoever. So this one, is probably the most speculative, but I think that you are probably familiar with examples of someone's knowledge being discounted because of their social location, their gender, their ethnicity, their race, and so on. So that I would say is probably the more familiar form of epistemic injustice. The other form that Fricker defines that I find very fascinating is when the speaker is not heard or believed because of interpretive gaps, because of a lack of an appropriate hermeneutic framework in which to understand what they're saying. And I think that this gap and the identification of this gap is very helpful in looking at the religion and science debate, or looking at how philosophy, spirituality, and religion contribute to greater ecological justice and ecological sustainability. Because science, as we've heard over the last couple of days, works with certain paradigms. Philosophy and religion and spirituality work with certain other paradigms, and often we don't have good ways to bridge them. So Fricker really helps us by identifying this as a hermeneutic gap, an interpretive gap, that we then can develop some tools to bridge, to fill in. And so I don't exactly have the tools right now, but I think even identifying this gap is something that we need to work on, is extremely helpful. Okay, so are there any questions right now about these two forms of epistemic injustice? Because then I'm going to give some examples, but if they need further definition at this point. Okay, so let's go on and look at a couple examples then. So the first example comes from Love Canal, New York, near the Niagara Falls. And this is the aerial view of this housing development that was built in the 50s. And what I wanted you to notice here is these white patchy areas where grass or vegetation couldn't grow. The reason why was because there was deeply buried chemical waste. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this Love Canal story. It's, as I said, it's a fairly paradigmatic story in environmental history and environmental justice that contributed to launching the environmental movement. And then I'm going to show that it's an example of epistemic injustice because people weren't believed. So in the 1892, William Love planned to build this canal that would connect to the upper and lower Niagara and allow greater transportation along the river. He was only able to get 300 feet dug and then ran into financial difficulties and so on. So there was this big empty canal that then became, hey, a great waste disposal site for the Hooper Chemical Company. Because it was just this big open canal. So they started putting waste in there. And eventually 20,000 tons of toxic waste was placed in this canal. And then subsequently it was buried, covered up. An elementary school was opened in the 50s where 400 young children were going to school. And then throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s, around 1,000 homes and apartments were built in this area. So that's what we just saw a picture of. And many of the people living in this area were blue-collar workers, some of whom worked in the chemical facilities nearby, and a relatively low income, relatively less educated community, so blue-collar workers. Next slide. And so they began to notice that the substances were seeping out of the ground, mysterious substances. They complained about odors. And the state response was just to cover these areas with dirt and clay, just try to cover over the substances, not really investigate what the problem was or anything. So Lois Gibbs, who is certainly one of the heroines of the environmental movement, she was just a housewife. She had a child who was not well, and she started to investigate and talk to her neighbors, talk to other parents at the school, and found that there were a lot of sick children and sick people in the community. And she started to make a connection between her situation and the broader collective situation, and realized that the entire community was affected. She established with her neighbors the Love Canal Homeowners Association. They raised complaints, and eventually the whole area right close to the canal was evacuated, around 300 homes. Next slide, please. And actually, maybe one more. Yes, okay. So this is a map of the area. These dots are the homes. This is where Love Canal was. This is the evacuated area, so the homes in the closest vicinity to Love Canal were evacuated in 1978. But as you can see from this map, there were a lot of homes that were still pretty close by that were not evacuated. So then there was a study, which is on the previous slide, we'll go back to in a sec, to map illnesses in the non-evacuated homes. And this is a map of the different illnesses. So you can see that they were quite extensive, even in the non-evacuated area, which is still in quite close proximity to where the toxic wastes were buried. And these curvy lines are old stream beds. And what they found is that the toxic waste could move through hydrological flows through these old stream beds. And so, particularly along the stream bed lines, there were the greatest concentration of illnesses. So if we can go back 1 minute, tell us what kinds of illnesses they found. So 1978, the closest communities were evacuated. 1979, the community did this study with a medical doctor and researcher and found that there was this increase in miscarriages, stillbirths, crib death, nervous breakdown, hyperactivity, epilepsy, urinary tract disorders. And particularly alarming was that only 4 of 22 pregnancies that occurred during that time were normal, that resulted in normal live births. So these miscarriages and stillbirths and so on. That's quite an alarming statistic. And similarly, that 9 of 16 of the children who were born had some kind of birth defect. So the community was noticing this. They were extremely alarmed. They were talking to the New York State Department of Public Health. That's this New York State Department of Public Health, who said, "Oh, that's just housewife data." Even though they were working with a medical doctor, and even though they were observing these direct impacts on their community. So what I want you to notice here is that this is an example of testimonial injustice. The people who were experiencing these harms were reporting them, and they were not believed because they were female, they were low income, they were working class, they were not educated. Lois Gibbs has a high school education. She may have actually gone back to school now, but at that time she had a high school education. So it was useless housewife data, even though people very close to the situation were reporting their real lived experience. And this sort of testimonial injustice has very serious material and spiritual, psychological consequences. With the dominant paradigm, even the material consequences are very serious and cannot be ignored. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then, so then they were vindicated, not once but twice. The EPA, so the group to the canal was evacuated in 1978, and 2 years later the EPA did a study and blood tests showed chromosome damage in the Love Canal residents. Okay, so they're vindicated that the chromosomal damage is leading potentially to increased risk of cancer, reproductive problems, and genetic damage. So then, finding out this information, they were extremely alarmed. They protested. They even detained for 2 days some investigators. They kind of kidnapped them. So eventually, the White House agreed to provide funding to evacuate the Love Canal families temporarily and then find a permanent relocation situation. In 1981, Lois Gibbs established the Center for Environmental Health and Justice, which she still heads, and it's now based in Washington. And then Occidental Chemical Corporation, who had dumped the majority of the waste there, settled a lawsuit for the residents for just under $20 million. Then, in 1988, the New York State Department of Health declared the area habitable. There have been some cleanup, but probably not complete. And in 1990, there were 9 homes for sale. And it appears that this situation has the potential to repeat itself, actually, because people are now again experiencing illness clusters and negative effects. And I didn't go that much into that research, so the point I wanted to make was this really paradigmatic example of testimonial injustice and its consequences. Next slide. And there's just a picture. Okay, so that's one. And then in 1992, there was another study by Yale and the Department of Health where they studied 27,000 births between 1983 and 1984, and they found that there's a 12% higher risk of giving birth to a child with a birth defect for mothers living within a mile of a contaminated site in New York, anywhere in New York, when compared to mothers who live farther than a mile from the site. And there was a 63% increase for those who lived close to the worst and most contaminated sites. So again, these mothers and other community members with useless housewife data were vindicated by the scientific research. But after, or 30 years after they first complained, 15 years after they were evacuated, so these things don't change immediately. So the point here is that testimonial injustice has significant and severe consequences. I think if we consider young children as the future, then increasing the risk of birth defects is a very serious consequence. Okay, so that's an example from the past, from environmental history. Now I want to look at an example from the present. So in climate change, and Becca mentioned my paper that's coming out soon, The Spiritual Significance of Glaciers in an Age of Climate Change, I've been investigating ways of understanding climate change as not only a material dilemma or material situation, but also I've been looking at other ways that people interpret it, that spiritual consequences, psychological And so one of the things that I've been interested in is how remote mountain communities understand the loss of glaciers that that are disappearing at a faster rate in high elevation areas than elsewhere. And so here's an example, just a visual example of how glaciers are disappearing. This is a picture from the Everest region of Nepal, a picture taken in 1921 where you see very extensive snow, and then a picture from a few years ago taken from the same vantage point where you can really see there's a lot less snow and ice in this area. And so mostly that's been interpreted as a physical change, okay, less snow and ice, less reflectivity of the earth, affects water flow, as Vanden Shiva was talking to us about last night, really affects the availability of water for crops, changes growing seasons, and those are all really significant impacts for sure. But I've been wondering what other kinds of impacts are. What does it mean for people who live in these kind of areas to notice that the landscape is changing so dramatically? Next slide. And just another example of really dramatic landscape change with glaciers. This is the glacier in Bolivia. It's not really clear how much of it is left. That's 2007, just a little bit. And some reports say it's totally gone. Some reports say there's a tiny bit still there now. But the extent in 1940 was this whole yellow line. So as I said, glaciers in very high elevation areas are disappearing faster than snow and ice in other areas. Next slide. And so you have this maroon former ski chalet up on the top of a mountain where it used to be a major ski resort, and now there's just no snow at all. Next slide. So in some of these places, gods or deities are believed to inhabit these mountains, and the local people have a significant relationship with them and believe that maintaining that positive relationship with their local deity is essential to their continued well-being, to their health, to their prosperity, their harvest. Mount Kalakarpo in Yunnan is one of those places, and also one of the fastest receding glaciers in the world. The glacier used to come all the way down here, and it's gone about half a mile back up the valley. Next slide. Another place is Mount Asungati in Peru, where villagers believe that their deity lives on top of the mountain. Next slide. And they take this pilgrimage up to a high elevation annually to worship and praise the deity. And in recent years, they've had to change this pilgrimage. Everyone used to take away chunks of ice that would become holy water that they could use throughout the year. And now the community has decided that they can no longer do that because they're very worried about the continued health of their glacier. And so they actually put guards at the edge of the glacier to prevent everyone from taking away water. So it's a very significant change in the spiritual ritual that they have. Next slide. So thinking about these spiritual interpretations of climate change and how we can understand that in the West, how does that get included into climate policy? Well, obviously it doesn't at this point. And so I would argue that that's an example of a hermeneutic injustice, that the people who are likely to suffer the most significant consequences of climate change, whether material or psychological and spiritual, are those people living in the global South. And they have this different interpretation of climate change that includes being aware of the loss of the deities and the loss of this relationship with the landscape. And yet there's not a way presently to include that into global climate discourse. Now, so for an example, for a visual example of that, I was looking at the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out last fall, and then Sciences Po in Paris did this great analysis of who contributes to the IPCC reports. So whose knowledge is going into those reports? And this graphic just really visually shows you that the developed West, as you might imagine, because where are the technical resources, where are the scientific resources to do research and feed it into these policy reports. But in the developed West, we have the very large numbers of people, scientists contributing to the IPCC reports. So the top bar is the United States, the next bar is the United Kingdom, and then Germany, Canada, Australia, Japan. And you look for people from the global south. Down here we have Argentina, South Africa, Mexico, Kenya, China and India, developing countries. And I don't want to overly generalize and say that the countries from the global south are, have only indigenous knowledge, and countries from the global north have only scientific knowledge. But I think that it really requires everyone's knowledge to get a grip on what climate change means and how best to address it. And we just don't see that here. That's the main point. And furthermore, I think that if countries from the global south that have this more spiritual interpretation of climate change don't have a seat at the table, then we don't have a way of thinking about that knowledge and including it. So again, a hermeneutic gap, a hermeneutic injustice. Next slide. And this, again, is another way of looking at the geographies of nations that contributed to the IPCC's reports over time. So this is the first one that was in 1990, the second one in 1995, 2001, 2007, 2014. And again, North America is in blue, so you can see that that's quite dominant. Europe is in red, also quite dominant. Africa is in green. So the percentage of contributors has actually increased up to 8% in the fifth IPCC report, but still very small compared to the developed West or the developed North. So again, I think this is not doing justice to the type and different kinds of knowledge that might be generated from the global south. Next. So also I was wondering if the latest report, did you have a question?
Within those working groups, what are the norms of information?
That's a good question.
Even if they're present at the table, is that knowledge have any validity
right.
in the discourse?
Right, well, and that's really my point about hermeneutic gaps, that even if they were present, do we have a way of making connections between Western scientific knowledge and spiritual, metaphorical, and narrative, indigenous knowledge? And that's a bridge that I think we need to build. So I actually had the chance to speak to the head of one of the working groups in AR5 this fall, and I asked him about how can you include more indigenous knowledge, and he said, well, we base all our reports on peer-reviewed scientific literature, right? And he said, so if there were more peer-reviewed scientific literature from the indigenous knowledge point of view, then we can include it, but it doesn't even exist. Right, exactly. So the challenge is, right, can you even get that kind of knowledge into the peer-reviewed literature? But right now there's just not even the research trying to go into the peer-reviewed literature. I mean, there's some, for sure. And there are some pretty cool papers that have Western and First Nations or Anglo and First Nations researchers working together to try to build these bridges. And I think that's a very optimistic direction. But I know of a handful of those kind of papers. So I would suggest that, for example, we need a lot more of those.
If they could somehow hear the voices and the spirits and get that into the peer review.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge. That's something that I'm trying to work on, and that gap that I'm trying to open up and say we need to work on that.
I was wondering if you're familiar with the songlines, like there's this,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know that basically like these songs of like people's in Aboriginal culture in Australia, these songs that are taught like actually give knowledge across and ways to traverse the entire continent, telling where resources lie and shelter and water. The melodies, like even at tribal lines, the melody continues for somebody who's a member of, say, Wallaby Clan. And when they sing that melody to somebody who's from the neighboring thing, even though the words may not, they can still learn how to traverse that region. Right? And so
Yeah, nice idea.
I thought of this
Yeah.
because there's actual knowledge that would equate to like a sort of Western understanding of knowledge, right?
Mhm.
Water is here, X marks the spot.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And I wondered, like, if anyone's doing work like that, where we know that there are, for instance, like actual takeaways, right, in a materialist sense,
Yep.
from these indigenous ways of knowing,
Yeah,
and integrating into this type of research.
that's exactly the thing that I think needs to happen. I don't know if it's happening in the context of climate change, which is what I've been looking at, but that's exactly the kind of thing, and how to put that together for Western science.
And it seems like there's two issues too. I mean, because you have like, there's indigenous knowledge, right, that we're not able to get
Right,
because we're not willing to listen. It doesn't fit our format.
right.
But then there's also like, are you familiar with like knowledge gap theory?
Mhm.
Like,
Not exactly.
yeah, I mean, like it's basically in Western countries, like or countries of certain socioeconomic like development, like basically the same way the economy, like when the money keeps going up,
Yeah.
like the knowledge keeps going up as well, and that becomes another form of capital,
Yeah.
right? And that prevents like these countries that from having the scientists
Yeah.
to measure and study the phenomena in their own countries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so those are issues that are absolutely relevant to systematic injustice and testable injustice. Yeah, and need to be addressed. And I don't have answers particularly, and more of a call for action. Although a couple answers.
Did you say
A couple, yeah, at the end, just a couple. So I did look at the most recent assessment report from the IPCC to see if it was including non-material values like these. These are words that I searched for, and I didn't really find them. Next slide. No surprise. So culture ended up being agriculture or aquaculture, affect, where I was thinking of mood, emotion, or affection, appreciation, was actually related to consequence, like what is the effect on something. I only found family mentioned one time, and knowledge in terms of like these questions about traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge. The report mentions, as we were kind of just alluding to, that there is an appreciation of needing to build bridges or connect with traditional knowledge systems. Here, combining traditional and scientific knowledge. And there's a suggestion that that would lead to a more robust understanding of what's going on. But, next slide, they say it has not been used consistently. And I'll just let you read this. So I'd say that in the context of the IPCC and the assessment reports, there's this acceptance of the idea that blending or uniting or bridging indigenous and traditional knowledge systems with Western scientific knowledge could be helpful, but the tools aren't really there. And again, that's an epistemic gap or a hermeneutic gap in particular. So I think that this is positive that there's a recognition of the need, but as I said, the tools don't yet exist. Next slide. So then the third example, fairly briefly I think, is of the idea of the Anthropocene. And you may be aware that some scientists have proposed that we, because of human influence on the Earth, we are now entering a new era that needs a new name. And so the era that we are in, or maybe we're in, is the Holocene, the recent hole that has been the post-glacial epoch of the past 10 to 12,000 years. And in 2000, the geologist Paul Crutzen had this sort of outburst at a geological meeting where he said, well, we're not in the Holocene anymore, we're in the Anthropocene. We need a new name for this time period because human modification of the Earth is so significant that it really warrants a new title. And so he said we need to call it the Anthropocene epoch. And this has created a lot of controversy. It's also created a lot of journal articles where people say, did the Anthropocene start with the invention of the steam engine, or did it start with the scientific revolution, or did it start with the atom bomb, or what? So there's some debate over when this time period of human influence on the Earth really officially started, or did it even begin with the start of agriculture, taking it back a few thousand years. But it seems like that the terminology is actually being largely accepted. And we heard Bill McKibben speak about it a couple nights ago, and you may have heard of it in other sessions here. Next slide. And just as a quick review, we have our epochs here. We're in the Holocene right now. We have our periods. We're in the Quaternary. We have our eras. We're in the Cenozoic right now. Next slide. So then this question of should we rename the epoch? And indeed there have been other names tossed around over the last century and a half or so. The Anthropozoic, the Psychozoic, Anthropogene, the Noosphere. And each of these have a sort of a different flavor, a different bent to them. In terms of epistemic justice, who gets to contribute to these names, and who do the names call forth? Who do the names elevate? Who do the names obscure? Next slide. So some of the questions then that have been raised in this Anthropocene debate particularly come from feminist philosophers of science and social studies of science people who say, who has contributed to this era of human impact on the Earth? And who are we obscuring? Who is this anthropos that we're maybe naming this epoch after? It's probably not the farmers that Vandana Shiva was referring to last night. And it's probably not 2/3 of the world. So who gets to name this? What kind of implicit assumptions and narratives are contained within the term Anthropocene? And naming it after this anthro, this man, does it reinforce the idea of men as shapers and women and nature as the shaped? And does that bring forward the kind of era or epoch that we would hope? And then particularly related to this question of hermeneutic justice or injustice, whose knowledge and experience is included, whose is excluded? So I would say that this question of naming and identifying the Anthropocene is a question both of testimonial justice, whose voices get to be heard, and also of hermeneutic justice, whose experiences are interpreted as we understand the Anthropocene. And the folks who are talking about naming the epoch as Anthropocene are talking about a very certain kind of anthro. Is the Western industrialized, able-bodied anthro. And that doesn't seem to include the experience of much of the world. And what about the non-human beings What about the non-anthros? Are we, in naming this, is this just kind of a threat that you guys are done if you're not a human being? So I think that this debate on the Anthropocene raises a lot of questions that are unanswered, and the geological group is going to meet this year or next to determine whether we are in a new epoch called the Anthropocene. But I really think that these types of questions need to have a lot more debate before that major renaming goes forward. Next slide. And so here are some other more recently proposed examples that kind of answer some of the questions that I just raised. Some of the very most recent ones are the Plantationocene, and with the recognition that much of the Earth's productivity is through this plantation mentality, and many of the Earth's people right now are working in the capacity of serfs or slaves to generate all this productivity for the capital, and so another term that has been proposed is the Capitalocene. But I think that in certain ways these are a bit more honest about where we are, what humanity is doing right now. Donna Haraway has proposed this Thulacene from this idea of the subterranean-born sort of monster that arises from the depths, that I think it can be seen both positively and negatively. I mean, in a certain way it can be seen as Gaia, re-exerting control.
Aspects of the group.
Yes, yes.
I mean, because it comes from Lovecraft, right?
Yes, right, yeah. Well, she actually says it doesn't. She says, her spelling is different, and she says that it doesn't exactly. But in any case, it evokes that idea of Lovecraft's monster. And
I think when you have a vision of Cthulhu, you become instantly insane. I think that's in the Lovecraft.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. So anyway, so I think, and then my feeling right now is the Anthropocene. You heard it here first.
Matt came up with that independently.
Oh.
How about that?
Like 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
Two great minds in one department.
How about that?
On the same floor.
So I think we just need to think more carefully about this whole project of naming and who is included and who is not included. Okay, next slide. So returning to the question of epistemic injustice and how it works, here again are the definitions that we've been working with: testimonial injustice, where someone's ideas or thoughts are discounted because of who they are, their social location, and then the hermeneutic injustice, where we lack the epistemic and hermeneutical tools to interpret some kind of utterance that appears to be, at first glance, appears to be sort of irrational or nonsensical, because we don't have the proper tools for interpreting it. So I hope that through these three examples, you've seen some of the ways that these kinds of epistemic injustice have real impacts in environmental decision-making, environmental thinking, and how dealing with them may contribute to greater ecological sustainability and better thinking. Next slide. I said I don't really have conclusions, but little conclusions. That we need to democratize knowledge production, that we need to take seriously the knowledge and the insights of non-dominant peoples and even non-human peoples, and we need to develop tools to do that. That we need to take people's self-reports seriously. I had a whole part that I ended up cutting out about how there's an increasing tendency to not take seriously people's self-reports. People say, this is what's happening with me, and we say, no, actually that's not.
You're wrong.
And the thing that set me off on that one was there have been a spate of arrests of parents leaving their children in the car for like 2 minutes while they ran into the store. And the parents are saying, in my very best judgment, it was a safe situation, it was a cool day, I left the windows open, it was a safe area. And the police officer is saying, no, you don't have the right to make that decision. So takes us in another direction, but I just think we need to take people's self-reports more seriously. And then we need to look at other forms of knowledge, like traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge, cultural knowledge. Next slide, here's a definition of traditional ecological knowledge. The cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission, the relationship between living beings with one another and their environment. Great book on this by Victor Burke's called Sacred Ecology, where he gives lots of examples of this. Next slide. Or what Louise Fortman, who's at UC Berkeley, calls civil science, which can be practiced by you and me, not just indigenous people, but a set of knowledge-producing practices intended to provide better accounts of the world. It depends on knowledge of a particular set of social ecological relationships. Concrete findings are validated by utility and are particular to a place, but may be capable of being generalized. So this could be observing your own land, your own town, your own backyard, and either creating your own set of observations or even participating in broader research on, say, butterflies or bees or something. Next slide. And so finally, as far as conclusions, I think we need to practice epistemic virtues. If we want to bring about epistemic justice, we need some epistemic virtues of humility, which Sherry mentioned, so that was a cool resonance. Curiosity and generosity. So a more open approach to other people's or other beings' utterances that doesn't dogmatically exclude them. Tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, appreciation for specificity that is definitely related to traditional ecological knowledge. And then in conclusion, involving local perceptions and interpretations could contribute to greater epistemic justice, ecological thinking, practice, and policy making. You got a question here?
Well, yeah, I don't know, I haven't read a lot about the controversies around the word Anthropocene. For me, so I wanted to raise the question of what motivates the name, because when I hear the word Anthropocene, I take it as a very grim word, and I take it as an indictment, because the evidence that we have for it is, for example, the amount of plastic in the oceans and its sedimentation makes it so that for all geologic time, no matter what happens to us, there will be a plastic layer in the geological sediment. So that's a marker of its beginning. That's one of its. But to me, so to call it the Anthropocene, to me, seems quite accurate and quite indicting and damning. And so, just based on the way it rings in my ear and the way I'm thinking of it now, I have no problem with the name. And I think, yeah, who does it include? I think we can name those names. The people who invented and just proliferated all of these things that we can now mark. The radiation signatures that mark the beginning of widespread nuclear testing. All that stuff, we know those people.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, well, and I guess the question is,
are we trying to name an aspiration here by the ecozoic or some kind of heroic name
that's
like that?
kind of the question. Yeah. And do we want to name it after the people who have created this devastation?
Right.
I mean, so when you were saying that, I was then thinking of those. It's a sort of terrible comparison, but maybe useful. Those crazy rampaging killers who say like, "Oh, my name's going to be on the front page of all the newspapers now."
Yeah. Right.
And so I don't know, but could we? Yeah, maybe, maybe. And again, who has contributed? I mean, if it's really kind of the 1% or the 5% who have created this plastic layer. Do they get the naming rights too, or then is it like the Google Stadium?
Shading, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully, shading. So the converse of what you're saying is, are we wallpapering over something with hope?
Yeah.
When really, we may be calling greater attention to the problem and hopefully more attention to solutions.
Right.
Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, and I think I hear what you're saying, Aaron, about an indictment. I also think people have taken Anthropocene as humanity triumphant. We won. Like, we control nature, we control material, it's all in our hands.
To me, there's just such a deep irony there.
Yeah.
It's chilling.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It really is.
We're not in a traffic jam, we are the traffic jam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So who are we going to point to?
Yeah. So I think that either a name that is less clearly triumphant, or a name that points more in the direction that we want to go. That would be my argument. And I would just like to see a debate about this, because they're really, Donna Haraway and Sandra Harding, I can't remember who else I had up there, have published a few pieces starting to question this. But I haven't seen really a large debate. I've seen mostly people just saying, oh, we're in the anthropocene now. Even Bill McKibben, and so I would like to question, and really the inclusivity of the term, because, as you said, the people who put the plastics everywhere, that's not most of the world, actually.
But it is us.
But it is us.
I was going to say, yeah, more than 1%, fortunately.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not really, I'm not sure. Suspending?
Issues pending. Pending issues.
Your issues pending,
pending.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I know I'm in between you and dinner. I don't want to keep you.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.